The wind cut the grey sky like a sharp razor. The small town of Red Hollow, stuck in the Western Virginia mountains, was one of those places where time seemed frozen. Wooden houses with sloping roofs, a peeled facade church, and an old tavern composed the center of the village, where residents lived simple lives and, for many, tedious. That late September, something changed. First it was the news. A white crow was spotted near the Blackthorn Grove, a dense and old forest known to be avoided by the places. The white crow, they said, was a surreal vision. "A omen of bad luck," the elders murmured, their superstition voices. "Nothing good will come from that." Daniel Hayes, a 32-year-old resident of the city, was a skeptic. Veteran of war, he had returned to Red Hollow 5 years earlier after an explosion in Afghanistan left him with an ugly scar on the right side of his face and a slight deafness in the left ear. Despite carrying an emotional weight that no one understood, Daniel was the typical, practical face. He had no patience for local legends or superstitions. He worked as a mechanic in a precarious workshop in the center of the village, but his true passion was photography. Daniel had a habit of exploring the trails around Red Hollow on weekends, capturing natural beauty with his old Canon camera. He preferred the loneliness of the forest to the suffocating noise of the small town and its constant rumors. And before we continue with this intriguing story, be sure to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This helps us bring more content like this to you. Now let's go back to the story. The morning after the first sighting of Crow, Daniel heard the conversation in the workshop. It was on Blackthorn, I tell you. Big, imposing, and white like snow. Martha said, the gossip neighbor who used to take her car to repair even without the need. I didn't see myself, but Sam, he saw. It was terrified. Daniel laughed as he cleaned the oil from his hands. White crows? Mocked. Maybe someone painted one. I've seen people do stranger. Laugh while you can, Danny, Martha said, crossing her arms. Everyone knows what happens when something like this appears. Disgrace. Always disgrace. In the afternoon, Daniel decided to go to Blackthorn, not out of curiosity with the legend, but for the possibility of capturing something rare with your camera. He didn't believe in bad omen, but he knew a picture of a white crow could be worth a lot. He took his backpack, the tripod and Canon, ignoring the recommendations to stay away from that place. Blackthorn had a dark reputation. Since he was a child, stories about disappearances and inexplicable things circulated around the city. It's just a woods, he thought. Trees and more trees, nothing but that. However, when he reached the edge of the forest that afternoon, a sense of restlessness involved him. The sky looked darker there, as if the sun hesitated to illuminate the place. The entrance was marked by twisted oaks, whose dry branches formed macabre silhouettes against the cloudy sky. Daniel squeezed his coat against his body and took the first step. The silence was almost absolute. Only the sound of dried leaves being crushed under his feet broke the stillness. He adjusted the camera, observing every detail around him. After 20 minutes of walking, he found what seemed to be an abandoned trail. There were marks on the floor, as if someone had passed over recently. Sam, probably, he murmured to himself, remembering the guy Martha had mentioned. Suddenly, a sound cut the air, a serious and dragged grass gnaw that echoed between the trees. Daniel stopped immediately, his heart accelerating. A few meters in the highest branch of a dead pine he saw the white crow. It was a mesmerizing view. The bird seemed to shine against the dark background of the forest, its feathers so white that they almost looked like light. She stared at him with black and penetrating eyes, as if evaluating every movement of him. Daniel lifted the camera with shaking hands, trying to focus. But as soon as the shutter clicked, something unexpected happened. The crow issued a deafening cry, unlike any sound Daniel had already heard. It was a cry that seemed to carry pain, fear, and something deeper, something that froze his blood. The bird then raised flight, its wings opening in a majestic way, but strangely slow. Daniel stood, feeling his heart hollow in his chest. A burst of cold wind passed him, bringing a strange smell, like wet earth mixed with iron. He checked the photo on the camera, but the image was blurred, as if the Corvo didn't want to be captured. Before he could sue what had just happened, a snap of branches echoed behind him. Turning quickly, saw something I didn't expect. A human figure stopped between the trees, immovable, observing it. "Hey! Who is there?" Daniel shouted, his voice coming out more trembling than he intended. The figure did not answer. It just disappeared into the darkness of the forest. Not knowing what to do, Daniel began to retreat. Suddenly, being on Blackthorn no longer looked like a good idea. But as he walked away, he noticed something on the floor where the figure was, a white penalty larger than it should be possible for a common crow. Daniel caught her, feeling a chill through his spine. Something was very wrong, and he knew that was just the beginning. Daniel returned home that night with a sense of restlessness he could not explain. He put the white sentence on the kitchen table by his camera and watched her. It was incredibly large, with a smooth texture that reflected the light almost supernaturally. He tried to rationalize. It must be a rare species. Maybe an albino eagle, he thought, but the idea made no sense. Eagles do not grasswise, nor are they stopped on thin branches like those of a crow. The next morning, the whole city was hectic. One of Red Hollow's oldest residents, Henry McAllister, had been found dead on his farm. The house was near the Blackthorn Woods, and the discovery shocked the inhabitants. The cause of death was a mystery. The body was intact, but Henry's face had an expression of pure terror, as if he had seen something that had killed him in fright. Daniel heard the news while buying coffee at the local cafeteria. People whispered low, but it was impossible to ignore the alarmed tone. He had strange marks in his arms, like deep scratches, said Tommy, the owner of the hardware store. And his gaze. Edith interrupted the cafeteria attendant. "I've never seen anything like that." Daniel frowned. The memory of the figure he saw in the woods bothered him, but he decided not to share with anyone. "I didn't want to be seen as another paranoid among so many superstitious. Still, something compels him to investigate." He took the morning off the workshop and decided to return to the woods, this time more prepared. He took a flashlight, a switchblade, and a small notebook to write down anything he found. Before leaving, he checked the camera photos again. The crow was there, but always blurred, as if his presence was a blur in reality. Daniel entered the woods through the same trail, feeling the same weight in the air. Each step seemed harder than the previous one, as if the forest resisted to its presence. After 20 minutes of walking, he found the clearing where he turned the Corvo the day before. This time, something was different. In the center of the clearing, there was a circle of white feathers spread across the floor, forming a pattern that seemed intentional. He took several pictures, trying to keep calm, but then the sound of branches breaking again made him turn abruptly. This time, the figure was not far away. It was a hooded, tall and lean figure with a strange, almost double posture. She didn't move, just watched Daniel with an oppressive presence. "Who are you?" Daniel shouted, his voice echoing between the trees. The figure tilted his head slowly as if studying it. Then he stepped forward, revealing part of his face. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and the eyes were of a milky white, without pupils. Before Daniel could react, the figure disappeared in a fraction of a second, as if he had never been there. He took a few steps back, trying to recover his breath, but noticed something that made him freeze. There were footprints on the floor, but they were not human. They seemed to be birds, too large for a common crow. When he returned to the city, Daniel found even more excitement. A second resident, Sarah Larkins, was found passed out near the entrance of the woods. It was alive, but it muttered meaningless phrases on white wings and empty eyes. The city doctor, Dr. William Grant, could not explain his condition. "It looks like a nervous collapse," he told a small group of residents gathered in the tavern. "But there is something strange." Daniel watched from a distance, feeling the tension increase. He started connecting the points. The white crow, the hooded figure, the standard of feathers, the deaths and fainting. Everything seemed to revolve around the woods and that strange bird. That night, he decided to share his experiences with someone trusted, Ellen Hart, an old school friend and freelance journalist. Ellen has always had an insatiable curiosity for local mysteries and stories, and Daniel knew she didn't mock him. "A white crow?" Ellen asked, writing down her notepad while listening carefully. "This is very rare, but the figure you saw, are you sure it was real?" "As real as you, Ellen," he said impatiently. "I know what I saw." Ellen promised to help. She plunged into research on white crows, local superstitions, and old stories about the Blackthorn Grove. After a few hours, he found something that froze their blood. In the city's records, dated 1864, there was mentions to a similar event. A white crow was spotted in the woods, followed by a series of inexplicable deaths. The documents described a white guardian, an entity that appeared to bring disgrace. "This can't be coincidence," Ellen said, showing the old newspaper to Daniel. "It's like it's happening again." Before they could debate more, a scream came from the street. Both ran to the central square, where a crowd gathered in front of Jacob Tanner's house, the city's pastor. There, painted with what seemed to be blood on the church wall, there was a symbol that Ellen immediately recognized. The same circular pattern. Daniel turned to the clearing floor. But what made everyone's heart to stop was the message written below the symbol. "He's coming." The next morning, Red Hollow looked like a completely different place. Fear hovered in the air like a suffocating fog. The streets were empty, the doors locked, and even the dogs, which usually barked at the slightest movement, were silent. The message on the church wall was still the main subject in town, but no one knew who had written it or how it appeared. Daniel, on the other hand, could not forget the circular pattern that turns into the clearing and symbol in the church. Something inside him said that it was all connected, but he didn't know where to start. While flipping through the photos on the camera for the 100th time, he received a message from Ellen. "I need to show you something. Find me in the library. It's urgent." He immediately left, the camera hanging around his neck and the heart rapidly. When he arrived at the city's small library, he found Ellen sitting at a table surrounded by old books and newspapers. His face was pale, and there was a brightness of restlessness in his eyes. "You need to see that," she said, pushing a yellowish newspaper toward you. The headline, dated October 16, 1864, said, "Tragedy in Red Hollow, the White Guardian and the Night of Silent Wings." The article spoke of a series of inexplicable deaths, all preceded by sighting a white crow. But what drew Daniel's attention was a paragraph at the end of the text. "The village elders believe that the White Guardian is a creature between worlds, a messenger of misfortune that appears when a serious transgression is committed. They say that its emergence is a warning, and ignoring it leads to fatal consequences. You're saying this thing, this White Guardian, is it real?" Daniel asked. The voice, laden voice, but also of fear. "I don't know if I believe it," Ellen replied. "But look." She opened another book, a collection of local legends. In one pages, there was a rudimentary design of a creature, a humanoid being with white eyes, gigantic wings, and bright feathers like ice. The description was frighteningly similar to the figure Daniel saw in the woods. "That's what makes me nervous," Ellen continued. "The last time the White Crow showed was before a mass tragedy. 20 people died at that time, all inexplicable. Apparently no one heard the warnings. Before Daniel could answer, the library lights blinked. The sound of a serious grasser echoed outside, so loud that the windows made the windows vibrate. Daniel and Ellen exchanged tense glances and ran to the door. When they left, there was nothing but silence, but Daniel saw something on the floor, another white feather, just like the one he had found in the clearing. "He's following us," Ellen said, taking the pen with trembling hands. That night Daniel went to the woods again, this time with Ellen grudgingly. She was reluctant to accompany him, but knew she needed answers as much as he. Armed with flashlights, a recorder, and Daniel's old camera, they followed the trail that led to the clearing. But when they arrived, the scenario had changed. The circle of feathers was larger, and there were strange symbols recorded on the surrounding trees. They looked like runes, intricate and ancient, which sparkled weakly under the lantern's light. It's not normal," Ellen murmured, taking pictures with her cell phone. Suddenly the same grasser Sirius echoed again, but this time it seemed to come from all directions. The wind began to blow hard, causing the trees to grind and dried leaves to whirling around them. Daniel felt the pressure in the air increased, as if something huge was approaching. "We have to get out of here now," Ellen shouted, pulling Daniel by the arm. But he hesitated. His eyes were fixed on something beyond the clearing, the hooded figure. She was there again, closer than before. This time Daniel managed to see more details. The creature's hands were long and bone, ending in sharp claws, and his skin shone with an ethereal light. "What do you want?" Daniel shouted. "Step ahead." The creature did not respond with words, but extended a thin arm, pointing to something behind them. When Daniel and Ellen turned, they saw the white crow standing in a low branch, their black eyes fixed on them. And then it happened. The creature and the crow seemed to move in sync. The crow raised flight, describing circles around the clearing, while the hooded figure slowly advanced. Each step of her made the floor shake, and the symbols in the trees began to shine more intensely. Ellen pulled Daniel with full force, and the two ran down the trail back to town, stumbled into roots and branches. When they finally left the woods, both were panting and covered with scratches. "That was not normal," Ellen said, holding her knees as she tried to recover her breath. "That was something beyond what I can explain." Daniel was silent, the lost look in the dark woods behind them. He knew that was not over. Something bigger was coming, something they couldn't avoid. The next day, another resident was found dead, and this time the message on the church wall was changed. Now it said, "The time is near." And what was stranger, the white crow was seen by several people flying over the central square. Red Hollow tension has reached its apex. After the third body found, people began to leave the city. Those who were locked in their homes, placing crucifixes on the doors and windows as if it could protect them. The mayor, an old and debilitated man named Frank Dugan, tried to summon a meeting in the central square, but few appeared. The only thing that seemed to unite residents was the sinister sound of the Crown Branco Grasna, which was now heard every night, echoing through the empty streets. Daniel and Ellen, on the other hand, were more determined than ever to understand what was going on. That afternoon, they decided to go back to church, where the mysterious message had appeared for the second time. Pastor Jacob Tanner, a man in his early 50 years, seemed to be on the brink of a nervous collapse. "You shouldn't be here," he said, as he cleaned the altar with trembling hands. "That woods brought evil to this city, always brought." Daniel crossed his arms, impatient. "Pastor, you know more than you are saying. These messages, the symbols, they are not appearing out of nowhere." Jacob hesitated, looking at the door, as if expecting someone or something to come in any moment. "When I was a child, I heard stories about the White Crow and the Guardian. My grandfather said the crow is a warning, but the Guardian, he is the executor. He comes to seek something or someone, and if you can't get what you want, he takes lives." "Seek what?" Ellen asked, leaning closer. Jacob shook his head, swallowing hard. "I don't know. But whenever it appears, it is because some serious sin has been committed, something that needs to be corrected." Before they could ask more, the sound of steps echoed outside the church. Everyone was silent, their eyes fixed on the door. For a few seconds, nothing happened, but then Crow's Grasna cut the air, followed by a strong beat. Bang, bang, bang. Daniel held Ellen by his arm, gesturing to move away. Jacob took a cross from the altar, holding it with trembling hands. But when he opened the door, there was no one there, just a white feather lying on the floor. "We're being watched," Daniel murmured, squeezing his jaw. "He knows we're trying to find out." Ellen took the sentence carefully and kept in her pocket. "We need to go to the woods again," she said, ignoring Jacob's alarmed look. "This time, we need to go deeper." At nightfalls, Daniel and Ellen settled on what they could. Lanterns, an old axe Daniel kept in the shed, and even an audio recorder Ellen had loaned from a friend. They knew they were risking, but they also knew there was no other option. Something needed to be done, or more. People would die. Upon entering Blackthorn's forest, the silence was absolute, except for the sound of their own steps. The trees looked closer to each other, as if the forest was alive and trying to swallow them. After about 40 minutes, they reached a part of the woods that none of them recognized. The trees there were gigantic, with branches so dense that they almost completely blocked the moonlight. And that's when they saw it, an old, moss-covered cabin, hidden between the trees. "I never knew there was a house here," Daniel said, looking around with suspicion. "No one knows," Ellen answered, pointing to the sculpted symbols at the cabin door. They were the same symbols they had seen in the clearing and in the church. They approached with caution, and Daniel opened the door with the axe in hand. The inside of the cabin was as strange as the outside. The ground was covered with white feathers, and the walls had designs of winged humanoid figures surrounded by circles and runes. In the center of the room was a table with an old book whose cover was cracked and dirty. Ellen opened the book carefully, her hands shaking as she flipped her pages. It was written in a language that neither could understand, but some words were underlined, standing out in the text. One of them was repeated several times. "Tribute." Daniel frowned. "Tribute? What does that mean?" Ellen took the recorder, recording everything. "It may mean that the Guardian comes to seek something in return. But what?" Before they could speculate more, a strange sound echoed through the cabin. It was a sound of wings hitting, but they didn't seem to be a common bird. They were very heavy, as if something gigantic were moving outside. "We need to get out of here," Ellen whispered, closing the book and putting it in the backpack. When they left the cabin, the white crow was there, landed in a low branch. But this time, he was not alone. The hooded figure appeared again, emerging from darkness like a living shadow. Daniel felt a knot in his throat as he realized that the creature's eyes now shone intensely, a blinding white that seemed to penetrate his mind. The creature raised one hand, and the crow released a grasnar so loud that she made Ellen unleash her backpack and fall to her knees. Daniel tried to pull her, but her own feet seemed attached to the floor. And then the creature spoke. His voice was severe, almost like a roar, but with a frightening clarity. "You dare to interfere!" The forest around began to tremble, and the runes in the trees shone in red. Daniel, in a last effort, managed to pull Ellen out of the trance and ran with her back to town, listening to the sound of the wings following them closely. When they finally came to the safety of their home, Ellen collapsed on the couch, still trembling. "We're not dealing with something natural, Daniel. This is something old, something that wants blood." Daniel looked at the book she had brought, knowing that the answer was there, but also knowing that every step that took them closer to something much darker than they could imagine. Tribute. The word echoed in his mind, and he feared finding out what it really meant. The next morning, Red Hollow was in complete chaos. 3 more people disappeared at dawn, and a body was found in the central square with the same scratch marks that had been seen in the previous victims. But this time, something was different. Beside the body, there was another message written with a dark substance that the residents feared being blood. The tribute must be paid. Daniel and Ellen knew that there was no more time for hesitation. The book they had found on the cabin was the only concrete track they had, but it also carried an inescapable sense of danger. Each page seemed to throb with a strange energy, as if the object itself was alive. While Ellen tried to translate the underlined words, Daniel did what he knew was necessary. He returned to the woods alone. Blackthorn's forest seemed different that time. The trees looked more alive, and the air was dense, making it difficult to breathe. The shadows between the trunks seemed to move, as if the woods were watching every step. Daniel held the axe hard, feeling the growing weight of fear. As he approached the clearing, he saw that the circle of feathers had changed again. Now, in the center, there was a stone pedestal where a bright object was resting. It was a gigantic pitty, unlike everyone else. It seemed to be throbbing with a silver, almost mesmerizing light. "That's what he wants," Daniel muttered to himself. But before he could approach, the presence he feared manifested. The white guardian emerged from the shadows, his gigantic wings extending like a veil of darkness. The eyes of the creature, bright and white, seemed to pierce Daniel's soul. "The tribute will be paid." The creature's voice reverberated deep and resonant as the white crow landed on his shoulder as an emissary of death. Daniel stepped ahead, his heart hammered in his chest. "What do you want from us?" he shouted, his voice shaking. The guardian tilted his head as if studying Daniel. "It's not what I want. This is what was promised. Blood through the blood, guilt for sin." The creature's words made Daniel freeze. He felt that there was something that was being hidden, something no one in town wanted to admit. "What a sin? What are you talking about?" The guardian did not respond immediately. Instead, he pointed to Daniel with one bone hand, as the crow released a shrill grasnar, and then, in the blink of an eye, the clearing changed. Daniel was surrounded by shadows of people, human figures who seemed prey between this world and the neighbor. Their faces were frozen in expressions of agony, and they murmured in unison, "The debt was never paid." Daniel staggered back, feeling a wave of despair swallowing him. He understood somehow that those figures were the souls of the victims of 1864, the same ones that had died the last time the Guardian appeared. But why? What did they have to do with that? And then a memory came to mind. Pastor Jacob's words. "The Guardian appears when there is a serious sin to be corrected." Daniel realized that the answer was not in the woods, but in the city. He needed to know what really happened at that time. Back in town, Ellen finally managed to translate part of the book. The symbols were old and referred to purification rituals, where a guardian would be invoked to punish those who profaned the earth. The text spoke of a necessary sacrifice, but did not explain who should be sacrificed, only that the ritual was the only way to placate the guardian's fury. "This is a damn game," Ellen said, closing the book tightly. "This being, whatever it is playing with us." But Daniel shook his head with a resolute look on his face. "No, Ellen, this is not a game. It is a debt. Something happened here, something that was never corrected, and until it is, it will continue." He decided to confront Pastor Jacob once again, this time bluntly. When he arrived at church, he found the kneeling man on the altar, murmuring desperate prayers. "Shepherd, enough of rolling," Daniel said, crossing his arms. "You know what is happening. You know what happened in 1864. It's time to tell the truth." Jacob raised his face, his eyes full of tears. He looked older than ever, as if the weight of the secret was consuming him. After a long silence, he started talking. In 1864, the founders of the city did something unforgivable. They found gold in the woods, but the place where they dig was considered sacred by the natives that lived here before us. The natives warned that the woods were protected by a spirit, but they did not hear. They killed the last of the tribe and took the gold for themselves. Daniel felt a knot in his throat, and the guardian appeared. Jacob nodded. He came to charge the price. They tried to resist, but one by one, they were killed. People said they made a pact with him, offering sacrifices to protect them in the future, but I think they never fulfilled the promise. The weight of the revelation fell on Daniel as an avalanche. The whole city was paying for the sins of the founders, the crimes they had committed against the innocent. And now, the Guardian wanted what was promised. Before you could ask more, the crow's Grasna echoed again, this time closer than ever. Jacob began to tremble, murmuring prayers without stopping. "He's here," the pastor said, his voice broken by fear. No more time. The church lights blinked, and the hooded figure appeared at the door. His wings opened, filling the space with a pulsating darkness. The crow landed on the altar, and its presence seemed to drain all the energy of the environment. "The tribute will be paid tonight." The creature pointed to Daniel and Jacob, as if making it clear that the choice would be theirs. Daniel knew he couldn't escape anymore. The church was immersed in a darkness that looked alive. The hooded figure, the White Guardian, was stopped at the entrance, its gigantic wings open, blocking any possibility of escape. The white crow remained on the altar, its black eyes shining mesmerizingly, as if spying on the soul of all present. Daniel felt the sweat run down his face as he squeezed the axe in his hands, but deep down he knew it would no longer use anything. It was not a struggle that could win hard. Ellen was behind him, pale and tremendously, as Pastor Jacob Tanner murmured useless prayers, his hands shaking so much that he could barely hold the cross. The Guardian's voice echoed again, deep and sharp as the winter wind. "The tribute must be paid now. You will choose or I will choose." Daniel stepped forward, trying to keep his voice firm. "Tribute? What do you mean by that? Blood? Does anyone have to die for this to end?" The Guardian tilted his head slightly, his eyes shining with a pale, oppressive light. "You know what was done. This place has been desecrated. Innocent blood calls for justice. If the price is not paid, you will all perish." Ellen, who had so far been silent, found the strength to say, "This is not fair. We did nothing. It was not us who profaned the earth or killed those innocent. Why are we paying for this?" The Guardian stepped forward, his wings shaving the church walls, leaving deep marks. "The blood of the culprits is linked to that of their descendants. Sin is eternal. Payment too." Daniel understood, with an overwhelming weight in his chest, that the Guardian was there to correct a mistake that had been unresolved for more than a century. But he also knew there was no way to negotiate. Someone would have to die. Jacob, crying and visibly in a panic, began to scream, I didn't know that would happen again. I thought they had solved everything. I thought it was over." Daniel turned to him. His patience was exhausted. "Did you know that all the time? And didn't you tell anyone?" Jacob fell to his knees, crying convulsively. "I thought if we kept praying, if we ignored the woods, it would never come back. I thought we were safe." The Guardian raised a lean hand and pointed to the pastor as the crow was let out another deafening grasnar. Jacob's body began to tremble violently, as if something was consuming him from the inside out. He shouted, his words becoming an inconsistent whirlwind of pardon requests, but in a second it all ended. Jacob fell to the ground, immovable, and a white aura escaped from his body, being absorbed by the Guardian. Ellen covered her mouth, horrified. Daniel stepped back, feeling the despair grow. "Is that over?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The Guardian looked at him. "Not yet. He was just one of the culprits. There are more debts to be paid." It was then that Daniel understood the truth. No matter how much they tried to fight or run, the Guardian would continue until all debts were settled. But there was something deeper that bothered him. The book Ellen had translated mentioned a ritual to close everything, a final sacrifice that would seal the blood cycle forever. And if, Daniel started hesitating, what if anyone offered his own life? Would that end everything? The Guardian tilted his head again, as if considering the question. A life of pure blood can placate the fury of the earth, but it must be offered freely. Ellen immediately understood what Daniel was thinking. "No, don't even think about it," she shouted, holding his arm. "You can't do that." Daniel looked at her, the eyes full of determination. "Ellen, it won't stop until someone does what is needed. Jacob was right about one thing. The debt was never paid. But that doesn't have to continue. Ellen shook her head, tears running down her face. It's not your responsibility. It's not fair. Daniel smiled sadly. None of this is fair, Ellen, but someone has to end it. Before she could stop him, he stepped ahead, looking straight at the Guardian. I offer my life, freely. The Guardian was silent for a moment, as if evaluating Daniel's sincerity. Then he spread his wings, which now shone with an almost divine light, and the crow let out one last grasnar before flying to Daniel's shoulder. Your offer is accepted, Ellen shouted, trying to run to Daniel, but an invisible force held her in place. Daniel felt intense warmth through his body, as if something was pulling his essence. He looked at Ellen one last time, smiling weakly, before falling to his knees. Take care of the city, Ellen. Ends these stories forever. These were his last words, before an explosion of white light involved the church. When all ceased, the Guardian was disappeared, just like the crow. The runes that marked the woods and the church walls also disappeared, as if they had never existed. Ellen ran to Daniel's body, but knew he had already left. Tears ran down his face as she held his hand, murmuring excuses he would never hear. In the following days, the city began to return to normal. There were no more deaths, disappearances, or messages. Blackthorn's forest was still there, but now it seemed less oppressive, as if the harm that haunted him had finally broken. Ellen remained in Red Hollow for some time, making sure the Guardian's stories were forgotten. But she never forgot Daniel, his courage, his determination, and the sacrifice he made to save them all. On the birthday of his death, Ellen visited the woods for the last time. In the center of the clearing, where before there were penalties and symbols, she found something unexpected, a single white feather, shining softly in the moonlight. Ellen smiled sadly, taking the pity carefully. Thank you, Daniel. And with that, she left Red Hollow, taking with her the memory of a man who faced the impossible and won, at the cost of his own life. What did you think of this outcome? Leave your opinion in the comments. We love to know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like to support our work. We see each other in the next video.